Hello, people. I'm Celine Coggins. I'm the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education. Welcome to today's webinar. The topic is how is COVID-19 straining the OST field and what can funders do? We have a packed agenda with some incredible speakers today. And so I'm going to turn it right over to Gwynn Hughes of the Mott Foundation to kick us off.
Thank you, Celine, so much, and happy Friday, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this call. For those of you who I haven't met yet, as Celine mentioned, I'm Gwynn Hughes. I oversee a lot of our after-school work for the Mott Foundation, and really thrilled that we're able to have this kind of Friday luncheon chats and discussions so we can all stay connected to what's going on for many of our grantees in the after-school field in general. And of course, most importantly, for the kids and families that we serve. So I want to thank you for giving your time today. As Celine mentioned, we've got some terrific leaders in this space, Gina Warner from NAA and Isabelle from CalSAC, who are really working 24/7 right now to support the after-school field and a lot of the kids and families that many of our grantees are working to support. I wanted to take just a minute here to provide maybe just a little bit more of a context for our conversation today, because these are such unusual and rapidly evolving times that we're in. You know, at the risk of taking some liberties, I wanted to name a couple things that I think might help us with the conversation today. And one is that I think that there is significant distress right now that is being felt by the after-school field, many of the programs, and many of the leaders that are in this space. In my own sort of zone of, working with our 50 state networks, I have seen that distress really increase over the past 14 days, as I'm sure other sectors are seeing. We are not any different from that, and our grantees are feeling that in particular ways. Everything from helping staff, apply for unemployment benefits, helping programs that may not have the rent they need to, continue operating, to, of course, the distress that they're trying to provide support to young families. So I want to just sort of name that's where I think some of our folks are. And I also want to name the dedication that many of, I know you share with all of us in philanthropy right now. You have chosen to dedicate your time to, and your profession, to supporting this field and education in general. That is also not an easy role right now, and we recognize that as well. But you have sort of given your service in this way, and I guess it's within that context that I wanted to sort of start off our conversation today, knowing that some of the things that we may need to say or listen to are not easy, and really making that okay for us to talk about. This is just uncharted waters for all of us. And what I love about my colleagues in philanthropy and the work that I've had the privilege to do on the ground in the after-school field, I think a common denominator is the dedication to the work. And I think it's important that we all, look to support each other. So with that, I want to turn it over to our first speaker, Gina, and she's going to let us know her perspective of what's going on with NAA and on the ground. Gina.
So thank you, Gwynn. Thank you to Kathleen and Celine and all of you who've joined today to listen and express time and interest in how you can best support the out-of-school time field. So, as Gwynn said, my name is Gina Warner. I'm the president of the National After-School Association. NAA is a professional and member association for the field of after school. We have 32,000 members around the country. And as the professional member association, we have created what are really the foundational pieces of work for our practice. That includes the National Program Quality Standards created in 1998, core knowledge and competencies for after-school and youth development professionals in 2012, and the Code of Ethics for after-school professionals. And I think that's important to mention because those ethical standards are not just guiding the practice of our members right now, but those are the standards that they live. So the times that we're in and the times that are come are some in which I have more than a fair share of both personal and professional experience. I led in the months after Hurricane Katrina, and for 6 years after that, the after-school intermediary. So I have firsthand experience in seeing the role that after-school communities can play in both disaster response and disaster recovery. And so right now, we're in a period of disaster response, and after-school community is responding. There are after-school programs up and running around this country, from Baltimore to Austin to Portland, serving as child care centers for workers of essential personnel. And so I think that makes our workers the most essential of essential personnel. States and cities are using existing child care dollars, and I think we can expect with the stimulus bill, hopefully getting ready to pass as we speak, an additional $3.5 billion in child care to include school-age child care assistance will be available, and I think we can expect more programs to come online with that. And I'll say this is exactly what we saw post-Katrina in New Orleans. We saw after-school, community-based programs, nonprofit, faith-based, up and running months and sometimes years before schools were operating. We know that after-school programs are the linchpin in so many communities. They're a source of support and information and comfort for families, and so we can expect that they are going to be there and continue to be there on the front lines. So in this immediate time of disaster response, and as we start to make plans, and we should, for the disaster recovery period that will come, I just want to talk about two important issues. The first is that now is the time more than ever to support our after-school workforce. They are on the front lines of this work, and that includes that we're making sure that they have resources for safety. I understand there are some provisions in the federal package that allow for that, and Isabel is going to certainly speak to some more on-the-ground specific experiences of what is happening with after-school programs. But this support for the workforce should also include resources for emotional support. After Hurricane Katrina, we worked with Save the Children and Mercy Corps and created a curriculum called Care for the Caregiver. Know that the people working in these programs right now are balancing their personal needs, their personal struggles, along with their professional work. And so we need to be prepared to create resources that address the trauma and build the resilience that we know that they are going to have going forward. And that should also include resources around virtual instruction, and with an eye toward virtual instruction and what that means, knowing that we are keeping top of mind issues around access and equitable access, because just as we talk about the issues of equitable access for technology for young people, adults in programs have those same issues as well. So those are all some issues that I think we need to keep top of mind. The second is that now is the time more than ever to support our profession and the systems that support our profession. And so I'm talking about national associations like ours. I'm talking about state associations like Isabel's. I see some of my colleagues on Every Hour Counts and some of the cities that are part of that network. Intermediaries will be key to the recovery for our field. We need them to stay strong and solvent now so that they can continue their work. And so this work means continuing to bring awareness to the structural fragility of our workforce, continuing to advocate for better salaries, for benefits, for paid leave, for access to health care. That includes ongoing support for the curation, creation, and connection, and information resources for our field. And that includes providing these intermediaries with the resources needed to support the sustainability of their organization and also the programs within their network. And that can be leadership development, financial planning, organizational development, staffing, and just frankly, flat out cash to be able to maintain their services. And before I turn over to Isabel, I just want to leave you guys with one thought. After Katrina, I saw many foundations paralyzed by what to do. They very much wanted to help, foundation staff and foundation board, but they were really bogged down in trying to make determinations around what they needed, what they believed needed to be strategic investments, impactful investments, investments that were aligned with maybe their programmatic areas or their strategic plan. The result was that programs suffered, our infrastructure support suffered, and that meant that children and families suffered. And as you can expect, that meant that our recovery was longer and more difficult than it needed to be. As a field, we are not paralyzed. We are stepping forth boldly and bravely to render our services, and we need you all to be our partners in doing that work.
Thank you, Gina, so much. And I think what we'll do is we'll move to Isabel, and then of course open it up for questions and discussion. Isabel is the Executive Director of CalSAC, which is a key intermediary and resource in California for programs. So Isabel, you're up.
Thank you, Gwynn, for the courage of your opening remarks, and thank you, Gina and NAA, for the consistent, just really high quality support that you provide all of us. You've been key in our capacity to navigate this moment, so thank you, Gina. So my name is Isabel Musab. I am the relatively new ED of CalSAC, and I come from the out-of-school time world. I spent before CalSAC 7 years as the Youth Program Policy Director at Safe Passages in Oakland, and I specialize in working with adjudicated and other marginalized youth ages 16 to 24 at that time. But I want to name a little bit also of who I am, because I want to speak to the power and privilege of this moment. I come from a first-generation family. My mother is a brilliant woman. She had an 8th grade education. I came to this country and learned to speak English, so in part I could advocate for her. I became a school teacher and went and got a law school degree, in part still because I wanted to be able to speak truth to power and advocate for people like my mother. And I came to CalSAC because I found in CalSAC a community of people who were just as passionate and committed about recognizing the expertise of the people on the ground doing this work. Part of the power of the out-of-school time field is that we come from the communities that we serve. We are of those communities. We live in those communities. We love those communities. We respect those communities. And so I think that we're all in this pivotal moment of being able to resource a group of folks who not only are doing the work, but they are the work. And so I just really want to own the privilege I have to be a voice for so many people who cannot be here with you today, and the power of this moment. And I thank you for being on the call. So I want to really try to do a good job of what I've been told by my colleagues, and I want to break it up into what agencies have shared with me and then what I've heard from the front lines. So I want to just name needs. So for agencies, it's including my own, it's for funders to strongly consider allowing for rent or lease costs to be included in either indirect or direct expenses for the next 2 fiscal years. For many of us, we're having to decide on an existential level whether to release our leases or not in order to secure our ability to stay open in the next couple of years. Another request that was made through me was for funders to consider a small business administration loan forgiveness or prepayment program. So there are many agencies that are considering taking up the possibility of an SBA loan, but may not be able to honor the payment terms of those loans. And so, you know, if funders could consider allowing for longer payment terms or loan forgiveness for those agencies that utilize those loans to keep their doors open, to keep their employees employed, and who provide support for those employees. Another interesting issue that's come up is that there are agencies who chose to be self-insured for unemployment, and one that has called me in tears saying they're laying off every employee at 15 sites in California chose to be self-insured and now has an existential threat of when that unemployment bill comes due, they don't know how they'll be able to navigate that. The issue of having the frontline staff become the providers of care for essential workers, I think also speaks really to the issue of privilege and power. This is the community that tends to be the first responders. Many of my colleagues are completely worn out from shifting from running an organization on the ground to literally driving their staff around in their own cars to deliver food to kids on the ground. And they're doing that at the risk of their own well-being. The EDs of those agencies are taking huge liability risks in doing that, but they feel compelled to just meet the human need in the moment. So another something for funders to consider is, how do you provide liability coverage, safety training, prioritize access for safety resources and testing for the folks who are doing the frontline work, such as providing childcare for essential workers. And lastly, for agencies, it would be really powerful for funders to consider creating a pool of technical assistance providers that could maybe get channeled through a national organization like NAA, such that state intermediaries could tap into lawyers who specialize in people who specialize in HR, people who could do an analysis of liability issues, people who could support TA on EDD claims, and folks who could provide technical assistance with insurance claims. All very real issues with a huge amount of technical complexity that agency leads are completely overwhelmed by, and most of them do not have the resources for. So I think one strategic way to address that is to create a pool of folks who can be tapped into to provide that kind of expertise, because we cannot afford to get that support. On the front lines issue, I want to bring into the room, so to speak, some of my colleagues who are on the ground doing this work. These are folks who have spent decades, who are from the community, who spent decades in the community, and who are desperately trying to keep it together as they're watching the communities that they serve really bear the brunt of what is happening. So first I want to speak about Brooklyn Williams. She is some of you may know her, she is the program director for New Door Ventures. They have workforce development, out of school time programming through the alternative education high schools in Oakland. That is a very important sector for funders to remember. We have all kinds of kids who are particularly vulnerable who go through the alternative ed high schools and that often are forgotten. New Door Ventures has completely pivoted to try to shift their work into virtual work, but they've had to do it with no technical support. So Brooklyn has done things like tapped into her vast network, found teachers who know how to use Google Classroom. Those teachers volunteered to upload YouTube tutorials on how to use Google Classroom that she then developed staff professional development plans to get her staff to be able to utilize with the youth they serve within 10 days. Which is amazing, but they need support. Agencies need support to be able to jump in and provide the kind of TA to flip and pivot into being virtual providers. The other point that keeps coming up is the use of virtual learning presumes, of course, access. And I spoke with Josefina Alvarado Mena at Safe Passages, also in Oakland. They were very quickly able to pivot to getting Chromebooks and even, accessing some of the free resources around Wi-Fi. But the issue is twofold. One is, even with those things, there are many, many, many families who need technical support on the ground from trusted community partners to get those things set up, right? To set up the modem, to just do that infrastructural work. And you can only have trusted community folks go into those homes because we're talking about undocumented folks, we're talking about English language access barriers and other things that really mean that the agencies need funding to be able to pivot their staff to doing home visits for people who cannot just be given a Chromebook and said, and told go. The other consideration that Brooklyn shared with me is that Of the 60 kids that she has in her cohorts right now, 13 had no access. Even after OUSD distributed Chromebooks and all that, for whatever reasons, they still had no access. And they don't use desktops or laptops, they use their phones. So I think many people are aware, but it's critical that a lot of this funding to pivot to virtual be mindful of the fact that many of our kids, particularly our most vulnerable, use phones and need to be able to access all of this through their phones, and that's a specific technical issue. I want to shout out, I saw Jennifer Peck is on this call. I want to shout out folks like PCY, Partnership for Children and Youth, who are doing training of OST staff at subsidized housing sites. That's another very key sector for funders to be aware of, is that if there are people who are doing work on subsidized housing sites right now, that is a key place to do interventions around COVID, because it gives you access to families that are the most marginalized. All of the folks doing this work, from the agency leads to the program staff to the families and the youth, are all saying they desperately need mental health support. I know you're hearing it from everybody, but they need mental health support. Brooklyn, when I said, hey, tell me your top 3 needs for the folks you serve, she said, food, my kids need food. Food, rent assistance for April and May, and mental health support. For the mental health support, it's key that funders know that we agencies who provide this, who have expertise in this, still need support to ensure that we are tapping content experts that can modify our existing social emotional learning and mental health professional development trainings to be responsive to this moment. Many of us have very strong work that we are ready to deploy through our trainer networks, through our current grants, through our work. And I think it's critical, given what is happening, that we be able to ensure that those curricula are really responsive to this moment, and in particular to the needs for virtual learners that may fall outside of the norm. Marginalized youth in particular, and how do you create a trauma-informed virtual learning environment? People are desperate, as you know, for social interaction. Many of our most vulnerable kids are extremely isolated and are not, a number of them, Brooklyn mentioned to me, are not safe in their homes and cannot get the kind of privacy that they need in order to share out with program staff what is happening for them. So the mental health support that they were receiving in programming, they no longer have access to because they can't find safe space. So she told me about 30 of her 60 youth are not sheltering in place because in order to get any kind of support, they have to walk away from their homes to be able to get some kind of privacy, to get support from program staff. So we just need to ensure that the ways in which we provide virtual support and virtual programming are responsive to those kinds of issues. And that requires technical expertise from people who really know those communities. I'm going to end by saying, making the big, bold ask that's come to me from all the different folks that I've talked to. So most of us who are trying to really assess, like, how long do we need to pivot for? What are we looking at right now? Everybody that I know who's in my position is asking themselves, how many, if any, of my staff do I need to fire? How much do I need to consider releasing my lease? Where can I cut my budget? And how much can I do that while still protecting my organizational mission and my ethical responsibility to serve the field? And so the ask is for 2 years of gap funding that is unrestricted and that has lower reporting requirements. And trust me when I tell you that I know how big and radical of an ask that is. And I want to bring into the room the voice of someone who just wrote an article, Josh McIntosh. He's the managing partner of Sea Change Capital Partners. And many of you may have read the article, but basically he lays out his advice for nonprofits, which is exactly what I just named. Consider going remote, releasing your lease, cut and slash, everything you can, because you're going to need to survive for 2 years. And then the challenge he poses to funders is, he says, the only thing that prevents foundations from giving more now is their desire not to privilege the present over the future. But at this moment, the present needs privileging. And that's why I want to go back to how I opened about power and privilege, is the funders have power to privilege in this moment the immediate human rights needs that our communities are experiencing. Folks need food, they need shelter, they need rent assistance, they need mental health support. And so I really want to encourage us to push beyond kind of how we usually do things and what our protocols have had to have been in the past, because we are in a crisis moment and people are experiencing crisis existential level needs that we desperately need your support in order to be able to meet.
Thank you so much, Isabel. That was so powerful. And just to take a minute to sort of recognize the bravery that you have for what you're doing and for what you're expressing on this call. I know I speak for all of us when I say thank you. I have to also just note what I've noticed with the state networks and folks like Gina and Isabel, who are leaders out there. The first couple calls we've had, none of them ask for things for themselves. They're constantly thinking about things that are needed on the ground for kids and families, and I think it just goes to the amazing field of leaders that we have in education in general, and then out of school time in particular. So just thank you to both of you. I wonder, obviously we want to open it up for some conversation while we have Gina and Isabel with us, maybe taking an eye toward, understanding some of the things that are going on the ground from your particular vantage point, what would be helpful. So let me just ask if there are folks who want to jump in with questions for our speakers. It's always hard when there's a lot of folks on a call too.
Rebecca, do you want to throw in your question? Or would Rebecca put a question in the chat box?
Sure. So I remember last week on this call, we heard from a few of our colleagues, I know at Hines and at New York Life, around some of the responsive grant making they were doing and lifting restrictions, which was fantastic, and getting money out the door sooner for grantees. I'm curious, from the folks on this call, has anyone done that type of work, but specifically gearing it towards more of the intermediaries, such as NAA, CalSAC, Afterschool networks, who are supporting the folks on the ground? Is that part of anyone's strategy currently? And I can share from our perspective at the S.T. Bechtel Jr. Foundation, we very much do invest in these infrastructure organizations, including CalSAC and NAA and some of the networks. And, their current grantees were at the end of our grant making strategy this year, but have done whatever we can within those grants to loosen restrictions, extend deadlines, lighten reporting requirements, which I feel like is the absolute bare minimum. But I'm more curious about ongoing new funding efforts that folks are working on or thinking about, or maybe need help from others on this call to either contribute to or just get reactions about and get some dialogue about that.
Anyone want to jump in? I know this is something that we're thinking about here at the Mott Foundation. And I know it takes some time, of course, to put these things together, but we're trying to think through it as quickly as we can because of the immediate needs that are going on. So would love to kind of hear more from others about just what they might be thinking about or questions that they're trying to answer.
What I can add is, as we were thinking about this call today, we're thinking forward of the next couple weeks of programming, and next week we're likely to talk about the stimulus package opportunities and maybe summer learning implications, but wanted to give folks a little bit of time to do the strategic thinking internally and then have a really action-oriented call. So we're actually targeting April 10th for that action-oriented call, and would invite anyone who wants to reach out to Gwynn or myself or Kathleen in the meantime to kind of talk over ideas you have, and then we'll invite you all to have a conversation in 2 weeks about that. But, you know, as Isabel mentioned, there's lots of opportunities for us to pool our funding together around some of these needs that our folks need on the ground. And whether that's an actual pooled fund or we're just coordinating our efforts, you know, we'd love to be as supportive as we can to help make that happen.
You know, Gina, one thing I think we were thinking about, and maybe just wanted to see if you and Isabel could expand on this a little bit. I think you gave us some great examples of what some of the major pain points are right now. Given your work on the whole Katrina recovery, could you expand on that a little more in terms of where you saw some immediate resources being most helpful, both for kind of the relief part and I liked how you framed it, the recovery?
Yeah, I think it's not too soon to start thinking about the recovery, Gwen, and to understand that, you know, we won't get to the point of thinking about recovery if we're not, you know, making some immediate investments right now. There won't be programs and certainly intermediaries and systems to support those programs unless we make some investments. So I'll just use that my moment again to urge, you know, that there are some investments right now to preserve that going forward. But I think partly it is thinking about, you know, what it looks like to do our work, and a chance to really rethink what that work looks like. And I think certainly we know programs are desperate for activities and educational opportunities and experience for their kids, and that's very crucial right now. And a lot of there's a lot of resources coming forward, and I think that's very important. I don't want us to lose sight of really the sort of organizational resources that programs need. And sometimes I know as nonprofits, we are very guilty of letting that kind of thinking take a back seat to really the services that we're providing. And Isabel alluded to some of this, and for better or for worse, Isabel and I both being lawyers, you know, probably think about this way more than many people or than necessary. But everything from looking at, you know, what our work looks like going forward, you know, how is that streamlined? How might that become more virtual? How might we be able to be more flexible in our work? What are our current HR policies? You know, how can those be streamlined? How can those be more effective? I think about the support that organizations are going to need in terms of financial planning. You know, 30-day, 60-day, 90-day, what cash flow looks like, and then going forward. So I think, you know, really those kinds of resources and investments right now. And as we talk about, Isabel mentioned, you know, whatever this technical assistance pool might look like, think about something like a Taproot Foundation kind of approach where organizations could get the kind of particular expertise they need. I think we have a lot of programs that probably don't have the maybe the communications infrastructure that they need to be responsive right now in this time. Everything from having the capability to access Zoom for staff communications, to staff having the ability, knowledge, and as Isabel mentioned, access. So I think there's just a lot of things that we need to think about, and this is very much the term we used in Katrina. You know, this is very much we are bailing the boat while we are building the boat while we are rowing the boat kind of time. And I think this is the moment that intermediaries can be extremely helpful to funders in sort of navigating these waters, and really be their really close partners in letting them know what's going on in their communities, what's going on the ground, but then also recognizing that they need resources to be able to preserve themselves.
Right. Thank you. Celine, did you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll just say a couple of things. So number one, everyone should know there's a very robust conversation going on in the chat, and we'll be able to kind of bring that to you after this, so that all gets recorded. But I was asked to kind of comment on, in the larger GFE community, what am I hearing? I'll give 3 quick buckets that overlap with everything I've heard already. So number one, the challenge of distance learning and the fact that this just further disadvantages kids. I'll go a step further even than phones to say that I have heard from plenty of different communities that there are plenty of people who don't even have phones, let alone devices. And so what can we do with TV? And there are some interesting partnerships with PBS and things like that that are emerging. And so distance learning, category 1. Category 2 is 100% just basic needs for students and making sure they have a safe environment where possible, that we don't lose contact with students who are homeless, that food is an obvious one. So all of those things that go into the category of basic needs is front and center for everyone from early childhood to post-secondary. And then the nonprofit space, I think, just as being so different from the institution of school or of university, and that whether it be, kind of support partners for, that like you all are in the out of school time space or in the early childhood space, what is happening is just so much more devastating than for, say, K-12 teachers who by and large right now have their jobs intact. And so what we're hearing, number one is we've made such strides in a short period of time in the recent past to making sure that we elevate new leaders of color in the space. And as funders think about who do we listen to, and let's give money to trusted partners, we also have to make sure to give money to partners who are trusted in their communities, who might not be our usual suspects as funders. And we also have to think creatively about where can we merge and create economies of scale. And I think I heard inklings of that in this conversation. I'll stop.
Can I just say an amen to that, Celine?
That's great. Who is that?
Isabel.
Oh, Isabel, thank you. Sorry, I was on a different page here. I'm trying to see who
I'll
else.
say one more thing. I just wrote a piece on this for the Chronicle of Philanthropy that's coming out next week, so look for it.
Celine, do you happen to know, I think this digital learning piece is going to be so critical, both for in school and out of school. And I think during these times, it strikes me that it's kind of like if you can do things, you want to make sure you're not duplicating what others could be doing. And I just wonder, are we connected with sort of the ed tech space and what they, may be able to supply or help? I think that a lot of the distribution of sort of technology and things like that are going to come through the schools. But
Yeah.
like Isabel said, we're going to need, I think, in this field, some of those resources because it won't make it through that system.
Yes, I think you're right. So I'll say a couple of things. So I've been more in conversations with funders from the same community and thinking about how can we be a model for other funders, or how can we have a conversation about making sure there's no duplication of effort, but that we're complementing one another. So that piece seems to connect. Then on the distance learning and the tools and that kind of thing, this is part of what I wrote about in this article. We actually, as we move to flood dollars into the system, and as we have this massive now experiment going on with distance learning, we actually have to try to learn some lessons and do some research to make sure that we can take away from this what tools scale, what is within district budget, what can be used both in the out of school time space as well as the in school time space, with what populations of kids. So there are a whole bunch of questions that we need to be asking as we go through this unplanned and unwanted major experiment.
Mm-hmm. That's great. One question that I see in the chat that might be helpful to lift up too is this idea of OST programs as emergency services. Gina and Isabel, do you want to speak to that a little bit? Because I know that's a quickly evolving issue and something that's really important right now on the ground.
Yeah, so even where states have mandated child care centers closing, you are seeing exceptions made for child care to include school-age child care centers that are providing services for essential personnel. As I think it's $3.5 billion in child care funds in the stimulus bill directed to programs for essential personnel, and I think we'll see that essential personnel definition widens. I think right now it's medical, hospital, first responders. I think that will, some communities are looking at include grocery store clerks. So I think that's going to widen. I think that is going to, after school-age programs will step up to provide the services. But I think, again, oh, you guys can't hear me.
You're cutting out
See
a
if
little
this
bit.
has this. Is this better? Okay. So I mentioned the $3.5 billion in the stimulus fund is for child care funds for programs for children of essential personnel. And I think we will see that definition of essential personnel broaden to have more child care programs able to open and serve young people. Again, I think this is going to be back a little bit more. Can you hear me? Some of our challenges with distance learning, right? And
I know. I think your
communication,
connection
right?
is
In
a
real
little
time.
wobbly. Yeah.
So I think, there will be dollars for programs. I think we will see programs probably having a hard time, and we talked about this a little bit yesterday in a group of leaders in our field, recruiting challenges and issues. We will see staff that we might hire to work in programs that are being presented with offers from fast food for retail as those programs come back online. Our field not being able to compete from a salary perspective and a benefits perspective. I think, as more of these programs are created, also issues that we talked about around trauma in the delivery of services as the staff members are balancing their personal needs with their need to work, the professional services that they're providing. I don't know if anyone
Thanks,
heard
Gina.
any of that.
A little bit.
A little bit.
Isabel? That was
first
great.
I want to acknowledge the lucidity of Belle Cantor. I don't know who Belle Cantor is, but I really appreciate the lucidity of your comment and the way you're thinking through those three areas. That really resonates for me in terms of the three things you've listed. So the thing that I'm hearing and that I'm experiencing myself actually for CalSAC, but I definitely heard from other agencies, is the tension between trying to be responsive to what is happening in the field while trying to face kind of the existential threat to the agency itself. So as a concrete example, and I won't name who this is, but someone was telling me that they had to really confront their C-suite at their major organization to say, like, look, I know that y'all are really busy trying to figure out the fiscal projections and ensuring that our organization stays alive, but you cannot pull the time and expertise of the fiscal team if that's going to mean that our kids are not receiving their stipend checks, because while the existence of the organization is critical and important, the stipend checks ensure that these kids are eating. And so like this very real tension that agencies feel between, like right now, I want to be doing the work. I want to be preparing all of my trainer network folks to pivot and to upskill into the virtual learning piece, to hit the ground. But a lot of my energy is going into like, do I need to end my lease? Do I need to, and I think a lot of us are feeling that. So that speaks to Belle's first point of like the bridge funding, right? What do funders do to support agencies to be able to respond to the immediate need if we ourselves are already kind of, stretched to be able to just make it through? And I think that's, again, that issue of like privileging the present over the future. Privilege our present so that we can have a future to keep doing this work, because I think the threat right now is that many of us may not make it through this long enough, and then you have to reconstitute a field, just like Gina's point of like, we're going to lose all of these workers. The premise that we're losing them to fast food because those wages are higher speaks to kind of the funders' longer term strategy around how is this an opportunity to address a structural issue of how undervalued, unrespected, and underpaid the OST folks are, right? So like teachers at one level, and then even below that is OST. And I would argue that's in fact because OST is even more made up of people of color, low-income folks, and marginalized communities than even the teacher force. So as we know that, the feminization of the teacher force kind of trickles down into the undervaluing of that field. The fact that the OST field is the communities that we serve further disadvantages them. And now here's an opportunity to like redress that. We shouldn't be having a conversation about like, we're gonna lose all these amazing committed people who really know the kids, because in order for them to survive, they're gonna have to go work at McDonald's, and we as a field cannot compete with McDonald's. Like, that's
Right.
crazy. And that's a call to action. I think if funders are feeling the tension of like, okay, we want to respond to this present moment. And I know that you do, but we also want to be sure that we too kind of survive beyond this present moment to be of help and of support down the line. I think that that's your down the line kind of strategy, is how do you support us in moving beyond this so that the next iteration, becomes a question of like, okay, how do we support folks who now do have health insurance? It's crazy that our folks don't have health insurance. How do we support folks who have a livable wage? And not this question of how do we keep people from losing their jobs and going to work in fast food and having to reconstruct our entire workforce.
Right.
And I want to be clear, hoping to, that is not a speculation on my point. That is exactly what happened after Katrina, that our field was competing with Wendy's, that was paying people $18 an hour, giving them 35 hours or more a week. So this is not a speculation. This is exactly, I predict what is going to happen.
I think this thread, and thank you for all your comments. I'm trying to follow those too. It does seem like this point that some of you are making, Belle and Isabel, you just kind of expanded on, really trying to help the field pivot to this ability to prop up. It's kind of like put the oxygen mask on the right people to help serve and continue to serve. And I wonder if there's more thinking that we can do as funders around that. I guess one maybe just last question for us that kind of speaks to some of the comments here a little bit is, there's a couple ideas that really seem like they might be able to help at this moment in time. Could folks share either through the comments or other thoughts on what some of the barriers that we may have for doing some of this, or things that would be, I guess, helpful to get out on the table a little bit?
I just wanted to add to Gwynn's question, because I do want to call out that Gina and Isabel have really put their vulnerabilities on the table here, and this is not easy to do. And this is a very difficult audience for them to do that in. And what Gwynn's kind of asking is for you to do the same. So what are you experiencing right now in your organizations that would be a barrier to, for example, raising to Isabel's challenge of funding your grantees right now with no restrictions for 2 years? Or what's a barrier to any of the things that you might be thinking about? And we realize that people are not, boards here, and they're mostly not foundation presidents here, but maybe we could share a little bit about what it is that you're actually challenged by in order to respond right now in the way that you want to be responding. Or if you've actually overcome some barriers, have some ideas about how to do that, because I can guarantee that whatever you're dealing with in your organization right now, there's someone else on this call who's dealing with it too.
I can start. I mean, I think we have a fairly significant investment in this space, which I think many of you are aware of, but it's not our only investment. So I think the conversations that our team is thinking through are understanding that there's other priorities across the foundation and philanthropy. It's making the case for how this helps our communities thrive overall. So I think that's one thing we've been working on. There's also making the case of, for the longer term, I think, I guess a way that we've been thinking about it a little bit and trying to test out a little bit is, often with funders, it doesn't work to just say we want to preserve capacity. And I don't think that's actually what Isabel and Gina are saying. And I don't think it's the best way to make the argument with sort of our bosses. It's about doing what we do better in a way and enhancing services, almost getting to that point of not losing capacity, not losing our investment that we've built up, and being able to build, to fight another day sort of thing, but even better. Because I think in our world, there's a lot of pressure to want to keep innovating and doing things, better and in different ways. And I think there are ways, I guess, to make those arguments. And I would be interested in working and learning with all of you for our purposes too, of ways to do that.
This is Richard from the Andrew Roddick Foundation in Austin, and I think my colleague Mary Riggs is also on this call. But even prior to the COVID crisis, we actually took on, as part of our program, an organization that we have been funding for 3 fiscal years, and that is the Learn All the Time Network, which is the Central Texas intermediary for out-of-school time. So we've decided that instead of funding them, maybe we could just incorporate them into our strategy of quality improvement. And they have now become part of our, they're part of our budget, they're part of our staff, instead of being a separate organization that would request funding from us. But one of the challenges that, and I think other districts are also experiencing, is out of school time is the stepchild of education and other agencies, primarily because it's not part of their priorities. The state of Texas just passed a budget last year for over $5.6 billion for education. And I don't think out of school time has ever been part of that budget. And so we're now fighting for a separate kind of budget rider on top of that prior to COVID to make sure that out of school time is at least an equal partner in learning supports for our community. But that has been a big barrier of why is out of school time always considered to be outside of education policy and education budgets, when it's clearly an equal and even larger partner, because kids, as you all know, are only in school for 20% of their time. The other 80% time is the out of school time sector. So I was saying, it's always a battle in the good times. And then in crisis, we are the ones that people look up to or look to provide this support. So, and I told this to the other group, we always have this Cinderella factor. We're not invited to the big party. We're always willing to be the servant to the wicked stepsisters. And then when the house is on fire, we're the ones expected to, help pull the furniture out. I think we have the muscle power to those demand to say, hey, in the bad times, we are the people that work 3 or 4 times more. In the good times, you don't pay attention to us. So I think there's now a story to tell throughout this time period of how the valuable kind of the value add that we put into children's development and education, and everybody should take that seriously. That's all I'm saying.
Thanks, Richard. Maybe we have time for 1 or 2 more comments. So we want to be, yeah, go ahead.
Hi, this is Laurie Dean. Sorry, my face isn't on. I'm at the Pinkerton Foundation along with my colleague Danielle Pulliam, who's on the call also. I just wanted to say, not exactly what Isabel was talking about, but the philanthropy community in New York City pulled together, because the truth is that our Department of Youth and Community Development is by far the largest funder of out-of-school time in New York City. And what we did is, along with our grantees, work to get the city to release their performance-based outcomes and pay their contracts in full so that they could do the work that they needed to do immediately and not worry about whether or not they were going to be in business at the end of the day. So a little bit of a different take. We're very fortunate in New York City to have a large public funded after school system, you know, feeling actually a lot of privilege right now knowing that that's what we have. But that was a take of what private philanthropy has done here. And to be vulnerable, as far as the Pinkerton Foundation, we're committed to keeping our renewals whole. In 2008, we had to have them all. So I'm really happy that we're able to commit to our grantees that we won't have to cut their grants. Taking on new stuff, I'm not so sure now. We go beyond the 5% as it is. So that's kind of where we are, just to put ourselves out there.
Thanks, Laurie. That's really helpful. Okay, anyone else? All right, we are getting very close to time. So I just want to maybe leave off before I turn it back to Kathleen to reiterate what Rebecca shared earlier, which is that, I mean, we are certainly looking at doing some emergency needs and initiatives. So would love to talk with any of you who are interested in coordinating on an effort like that. I know it definitely helps us from where we sit to be able to kind of do this type of response in partnership and really kind of open to, you know, ways to do this in the right way that might be feasible, and understand that you know, everybody sort of will come at this differently based on their priorities and organizations. So please reach out to Kathleen or Rebecca or I if you're interested. I think we're trying to set up an action call for next week, possibly, Kathleen, right? Or 2 weeks? Okay. So we'll be in touch too, and just let you know what we're working on with that. Kathleen or Celine, any final comments from both of you?
Well, I'll just say, first of all, thank you so much to Isabel and Gina, Gwynn, and the other folks who have stepped up to plan these calls. We are going to have a call next Friday where we're going to focus on summer. Marlon Torres is going to facilitate from New York Life, and Aaron Dworkin from National Summer Learning Association will join us, and probably a couple of other people too. And then the Friday after that, we're going to, as Gwynn said, reserve that call not with a particular content focus, but a conversation among funders about what type of action people are taking, either individually, but really what kind of potential do we have to actually come together in collaborative and aligned ways to meet the needs of this moment. So we will be in touch with all of you on that. I just put my email in the chat. You know, again, this OST impact group kind of like was planning and then all of a sudden became, and so we're just going.
Right.
So, you know, it's not all, like all the T's aren't crossed yet, but please connect with me and be a part of this conversation in whatever way that you can. And Celine, I'll turn it to you.
Just thank you. I love getting to be a part of this community. I learned a ton, so thank you to everyone, and I'm excited for next week.